Hello, I'm Carrie Marks. Today I'm in the Flyer TV studios in Kennedy Union on the campus of the University of Dayton to talk to you about a unique opportunity for all of the university's first-year students. The First Year Immersion program is a partnership between the Dayton Performing Arts Alliance Ballet and UD. On April 3rd, first-year students will experience the ballet Romeo and Juliet at the Schuster Theater in downtown Dayton. Students in a number of disciplines are already preparing for the performance by learning about the various aspects of Romeo and Juliet. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Laura Hume from the Department of History and Drs. Elizabeth Mackey and Alex McLeod from the Department of English, who will talk to us about Shakespeare's world and Romeo and Juliet. Thank you for joining us today. Now, I know it might be a little challenging to summarize, but from a historical perspective, could you generally describe the Elizabethan world from the time Shakespeare was writing Romeo and Juliet?
I should probably start since I'm the historian. It was a time of tremendous change. The 16th century world was very different, even from just the 15th century world that preceded it. The economy was changing from a feudal economy to a commercial economy. People were leaving the land in remarkable numbers and moving to the cities. London changed numbers a lot, from about 150,000 at the beginning of the century to 250,000 by the end of the century. The population of England increased from about 2.8 million to about 4.1 million. So
wow.
That's a big increase when you consider the time period. So just those kind of ripple effects had a big impact. The population's composition was changing. Everybody today tends to think of the Elizabethan period and Shakespeare, and they have in their mind pictures of the nobility, the people in the fancy clothes. But those people were only about 3% of the population. Most of the population was pretty poor. There was a lot of what we would today call homelessness. They called them vagabonds and masterless men. Those were the people that were driven off the land when they started moving towards more commercial farming, enclosing the land and using it for raising sheep for the increasing textile industry. Education was on the rise, though. Literacy rates increased, going from about 20% to about 35% by the end of the century. So that's a mark in the win column. So that's good. Let's see, what other kinds of things can we talk about? Big change was Protestant Revolution had happened earlier in the century, but it made for some pretty tense divisions in the Elizabethan world of Shakespeare. You had lots of these underlying tensions in the society. So because of these tensions, there was a very big emphasis on order. Order was a very big concern in Elizabethan society. And because of this, people looked to the monarch. They looked to Elizabeth as the person who would guarantee order. And so she was constantly reminding her people in a variety of ways that she was their last best hope for maintaining order, and reminded them of that all the time in a lot of ways, and encouraged them to rely on her. And if they didn't do it in a loving way, she sort of brought out the stick every now and then to remind them. But other changes that were going on were, in fashions, in food. They were a lot more connected to the continent. There was a new social class that rose up that was a lot connected with Romeo and Juliet, what we call gentry, or lower classes of the nobility. Families like the Montagues and the Capulets were lower nobility, who were the wealthy, who had risen up from the middle class.
Okay. So then with this order and this development in class structure, where did the theater and the actors fit in Elizabethan society?
Well, that's a great question that I think I might start with. So the theater was actually a disorderly place. It's not necessarily the pristine place that we think of today when we go to the theater. It was outside the city boundaries because it was a place of license. And also, so it's a place of disorder. It was considered a place of disorder. You had playwrights who were making particularly social comments, say on Elizabeth's rule and what they or James's rule and what they thought about the sovereign at the time. They would respond to particular social tensions, like Dr. Hume mentioned. So there were some social unrest as well as political unrest that's happening around the theater. There's also an issue in terms of the actors who are on stage. The theater itself was kind of a place or a site of contest where you have a very male space. So women were not allowed to perform on the stage in Elizabethan England. You would have boys playing women's parts, particularly girls' parts. So in Romeo and Juliet in Shakespeare's time, Juliet is played by a young boy, which is really interesting. I like to remind my students of this often. But this created problems, right? Because what does it mean when you have a boy who's dressed as a girl on stage and who's dressed as meant to be an attractive girl on stage? What might this do to the male actors on stage as well as the men in the audience, and even to some extent the women who might be attracted to these boys who are dressed as girls? So you have a lot of unrest happening around the theater where Puritans, religious reformers were particularly concerned about what that meant in terms of gender, in terms of religious religious morals. That's happening around the theater.
One thing I'd like to add to that, in terms of the order in the society, historically speaking, is that theoretically, at least, they all believed in something called the Great Chain of Being. Mm-hmm. And this was that everybody and even everything had its place in the universe, all the way from God at the top to rocks at the bottom. And that you had your place. And if you got out of place, it messed up the order of the universe, and that chaos could ensue. And actors actually, there's a document from the period that shows actors in the Great Chain of Being. And they're right above the line that equates thieves and pirates.
Oh, wow.
So actors are right above thieves and pirates in the Great Chain of Being. And so they weren't terribly well thought of socially in the Great Chain of Being. So I like to think of them a little bit better than that. But in the Great Chain of Being, they weren't terribly well regarded.
Well, and you have the playwrights who are really trying to address that chain, and like what happens when we have people who are trying to move up this ladder, right? The social mobile class. Right. What kinds of questions can we ask about that is really what the theater is trying to address. Right. What happens when women may not want to marry and have children the way that they were expected to? Right. Can a king stop being a king? You know, playwrights are certainly asking questions about that particular order and what it means and why it exists.
Yeah, I would sort of echo all that. The thing that strikes me is that nowadays we tend to think of Shakespeare as terribly conservative, high culture, and I think when we put him back in his historical moment, the theatre is a much more radical, questioning, upsetting site, one that very much disturbed the authorities, associated with all kinds of other entertainments because of the proximity outside the city limits. Bear baiting, these awful animal sports, prostitution. So, Yeah, and as you say, the actors were struggling to cement a legitimate place in society. They had been very much associated with vagabonds, vagrants, because they were always traveling.
Right.
In the 1570s is when we, in England, first have a stationary theatre. Up until that time, if you wanted to perform, you travelled and you used makeshift stages. So, and then lastly, I would just say that it's an extremely popular form of entertainment, bringing in all sorts of people. And that worries the authorities too. Anytime you've got that amount of people in one place, very concerning. So, yeah.
Okay. So what other forms of entertainment were available at the time that maybe were considered more or less radical, or listed higher on the order of beings? Or?
Yeah, well, if you look at the maps that we have of London from the time, the theatre is always in proximity with, because it's outside the city limits, these other arenas. And so I just mentioned bear baiting, but there was also bull baiting, and these were sports where these magnificent creatures would be chained and then dogs set upon them, and people would gamble on who would outlast who. And that, I think that speaks to the sensibility of the age. They weren't as sensitive as we are to certain things. They were much more accepting of violence in their entertainment.
They certainly enjoy violence. A lot of public executions became actually sites of performance. There's the idea that the scaffold is equated with the stage in the period. So public punishments were also entertaining. It would gather crowds, whether it was a local punishment of a shrew in her particular neighborhood, or if it was a public punishment where, a drunkard would be kept in the stocks for a number of days or weeks, depending on the offense. You have crowds who are gathering and watching and being thoroughly entertained by these kinds of things. A little bit more specific to the higher culture would be the mask entertainment that were performed at court, which is kind of a combination of pantomime, dialogue, and song and dance performances.
Where women could perform.
Right, or in closet dramas as well that were written and performed in private households where women could read parts.
Right.
So you kind of have a variety of entertainments connected to the stage.
Okay. So then touching on another cultural aspect during this time, I know a lot of Shakespeare's characters like Juliet, Desdemona, and Miranda all get married at a very young age. Was this a norm, and what were some of the cultural expectations regarding courtship and marriage?
That depended on your class. Saying that there was an average age is kind of deceptive because it was related to your class. It's something of a myth that everybody got married really young back then. Because, yes, women got betrothed or married very young if they were in the nobility or the royalty, because they were used to cement alliances between great houses or between royal families. So that's true. As a matter of fact, Queen Elizabeth's great grandmother gave birth at 12, or got married at 12 and gave birth at 13. Okay, yeah, imagine. All right, hard to imagine.
Yeah.
But it actually was a cause of some scandal. So that tells you it was out of the norm. But the average age for commoners, based on parish records that recorded things like births and deaths and marriages, for commoners, for the peasant class, for the yeoman class, shows that for women it was 24 and for men it was 25. And the reason for that is because they had to save up enough money to set up a household. So it's only for the nobility and the royalty that it was young, and it was for political purposes. So it was like us for the rest of the world. They had to save up enough money to set up households.
Okay. So what are some of the themes or issues that audience members should be aware of when they read Romeo and Juliet?
I'll start. So one theme would be, I think, the idea of intermixed marriages. The conduct literature of the period often tells parents that you should not create a mixed marriage between your son or daughter and someone else's son or daughter. And what they mean by that is mixing class. So this goes back to the great chain of being that Dr. Hume was talking about a little bit earlier. They wanted people to marry within the same class. They wanted people to marry within the same race. And in this particular period, that's often defined by one's religious affiliations. So they thought about religion as a race. So Protestant conduct book writers are very adamant about not marrying Catholics. So you see a little bit of that happening in Romeo and Juliet, and how Shakespeare seems to be challenging that particular idea and putting Romeo and Juliet together. Another, I think, important theme is the issue of violence, connected to the outside world and what's happening in England at the particular time. But you see a lot of violence in the play that we actually forget about because we get so focused on Romeo and Juliet's relationship. We forget about the opening scene, which is a big battle between the two family members, and it turns fatal midway through the play, where different family members are killing each other. And then, of course, it's violent to commit suicide, as Romeo and Juliet do. I also think that the issues of time and timing are important to understanding the play. One of the things that critics write about when they talk about this play is how characters just seem to miss each other, and that could have prevented the tragedy, and it all has to do with time. There are some critics who talk about the issues surrounding the Julian and the Gregorian calendar, and how their sense of time is changing simply because the calendar time is changing, and that Shakespeare seems to incorporate that into the play. But also it's a play that takes place during the month of July, and astrologers at the time would mention the ways in which July, as the hottest month, is also the month that will create the most violence and the most harm to people. So that's important. And then I think language is really important to understanding the play, particularly the role, from the way that I teach this play, the role of the oxymoron, which is a rhetorical device that joins two opposites to create something new. It's a strategy that Shakespeare uses to write the play, and you can see how that's related to the plot with Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, I would just add, I think the big one is the individuals versus society. That's always a great one in sort of the great books of literature. In this play, it's also complicated by a sense of fate. The way the play opens, talking about these star-crossed lovers, you already know their demise is inevitable, and so they're fighting against so much. They're fighting against their parents, they're fighting against their families, they're fighting against social structures, and then they're also fighting against this overarching sense of fate. And I think one of the reasons the play is so handy for people to adopt is because of the way we romanticize that struggle of the individual against society. So that, to me, is probably the biggest one. One of the things that interests me in the play is about motivations. I think the play asks some interesting questions about why people do the things they do. And I think one of the things that's exposed in the play is the way that the excuse, "we have your best interests in mind," is exposed as always self-interest. So the parents who want to push their daughter into a marriage the suggestion is it's for your betterment, but really it's for theirs. And this, I think, calls into question the friars' motives and a lot of people's motives. They seem, at the end of the day, to have their self-interest at heart, not others. So it's sort of an expose of society, I find.
So then in what way would you say the setting and like society at this time complements the drama?
Yeah, for me the setting is not just Italy, it's not just Verona. For me it's also space. I find the use of space in Romeo and Juliet incredibly intriguing. So where action takes place, I think, complements the action taking place. So the public square, the garden, the balcony, the bedchamber, the tomb, these reflect the rise and fall of the action of the destiny of the lovers. They are at their apex in the highest space, the bedchamber, having used this rope ladder. And of course we're working our way to culminate below ground, presumably in the tomb. So I find that Shakespeare is always up to interesting things in terms of how he manipulates space and how it complements the content.
Or the street.
Yes,
the street
right,
is
right.
the place where the play opens, and you could imagine it as the place where the play ends, depending on how it's performed. So what happens in the street and the role of public is really important to understanding the setting of the play.
Yeah, these intimate spaces where the action takes place versus the public square, and the use of light and dark to complement that as well. And whenever we're in the public space, the sun is full glare, and when the lovers are at their most intimate, it's always darkness, whether that's the garden, the bedchamber, the tomb. So yeah, it's just a lovely artistic kind of complement, these things.
Okay, so then just as one final thought, I know we're running out of time. When students are watching the ballet, are there any particularly important historical points that they should keep in mind?
Very briefly, since I know we have to close. Alex mentioned parents. Whose best interests when they're telling you what to do? Shakespeare can be said to maybe having a subtle critique of Elizabeth's government, Tudor paternalism, because she had that authority thing where she's saying, I know what's best, I'm telling you what to do, I'm ruling with this velvet gloved iron fist, I know what's best. Maybe there's something in there. Maybe there's a reflection of a famous feud that culminated right before he wrote the play between two noble families in England, where the Danvers and the Longs, where one son murdered another son, and it involved big noble houses in a big scandal before it was all done. But just so that the students are aware that the historical does inform the literary, that there's a historical context to these things. That would be what I would ask the students to keep in mind.
Definitely. Well, thank you again for joining us today. As you are aware, Romeo and Juliet will be performed for first-year students on April 3rd at the Schuster Center in downtown Dayton. Thank you for joining us.